There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. The pattern is invisible. It runs beneath every conversation, every decision, every quiet moment before sleep. Edgar Cayce, the man who gave over 14,000 medical and spiritual readings in documented trances between 1901 and 1945, returned to this single instruction more than any other. Empty your mind. Not as meditation, not as escape, but as the only way to stop feeding the architecture of your own limitations. And scientists are now seeing, through neuroimaging and behavioral psychology, that the mental loops most people run unconsciously may be hardwiring patterns that become nearly impossible to break.
Most people assume their thoughts are reactions to the world. Cayce's readings suggested the opposite, that thoughts, repeated and unexamined, begin to construct the world itself. That the mind, left uncleared, becomes a closed system, echoing the same fears, the same judgments, the same narrow predictions, until those predictions become the only reality a person can perceive. He described it not as philosophy, but as mechanics, the mind as a vessel, and when that vessel is never emptied, it can only recirculate what it already contains. If you're watching this, consider staying, because what comes next contradicts almost everything we're taught about thinking. In 1934, a woman wrote to Cayce asking why her life felt so constrained, despite her efforts to change it. His response, delivered in trance, was direct. He told her that her mind was not the problem. Her unwillingness to empty it was. That she was filling every gap with noise, with analysis, with memory, with rehearsed narratives about who she was and what was possible. And that as long as she continued, she would only meet herself again and again in every new situation. The reading didn't offer her a solution. It offered her a warning. That the mind, when never cleared, begins to calcify. And that calcification feels like personality, like identity, like the unchangeable truth of who you are. Modern neuroscience has started to map this process. Studies on default mode network activity show that when the brain is not engaged in a specific task, it defaults to self-referential thought. Memories, judgments, predictions. The same neural pathways fire over and over, reinforcing the same stories. Researchers at Stanford found that people with high default mode activity report feeling trapped in repetitive thought patterns. They describe it as mental rumination. Cayce called it something else. He called it building a prison you mistake for a home. But here's the first contradiction. Cayce wasn't advocating for positive thinking. He never told people to replace negative thoughts with affirmations. He said the opposite, that replacing one thought with another still keeps the mind full. That the goal is not better thoughts, but no thoughts. Not emptiness as a void, but emptiness as a clearing, a space where something other than repetition can enter. And he insisted that most people, even those seeking spiritual growth, misunderstand this completely. They try to fill their minds with better content, better beliefs, better visualizations, and in doing so, they only tighten the structure they're trying to escape. In a 1943 reading, a man asked Cayce how to stop feeling controlled by fear. Cayce's answer was unsettling. He said the man wasn't controlled by fear. He was controlled by the refusal to stop thinking about fear. That every time the man tried to think his way out of fear, he reinforced the neural grooves that kept fear alive. That the only way out was to stop, to empty the mental loop entirely. Not to solve the fear, not to understand it, but to stop feeding it the only fuel it needs, attention. This contradicts the entire self-help industry. It contradicts cognitive behavioral therapy. It contradicts the assumption that you can think your way into a better life. Cayce's message was more radical. He suggested that thinking itself, when chronic and uninterrupted, becomes the obstacle. That the mind, like a cluttered room, needs to be emptied before anything new can enter. And that most people spend their entire lives rearranging the clutter. Psychological research into thought suppression offers a strange validation. Studies show that trying to stop thinking about something makes you think about it more. The famous white bear experiment demonstrated this in 1987. Participants told not to think about a white bear, thought about it constantly. The act of suppression created obsession. But Cayce wasn't talking about suppression. He was talking about something subtler. He was talking about cessation, about a state where the machinery of thought simply stops running, where the mind doesn't fight itself. It just goes quiet. And here's the second contradiction. Cayce insisted that this emptiness is not passive, that when the mind is truly empty, it becomes responsive, that it begins to perceive information it couldn't access before. Not psychic information necessarily, but patterns, connections, intuitions that are drowned out when the mind is full. He described it as tuning a radio. You can't hear the signal if the static is too loud. And for most people, the static never stops. It's the constant internal monologue, the endless analysis, the reflexive judgments that feel like consciousness but are actually just noise. In quantum cognition studies, researchers have found that decision-making often happens before conscious thought, that the brain registers a choice milliseconds before the person becomes aware of it. This suggests that conscious thought may not be driving decisions at all. It may just be narrating them after the fact. Cayce pointed to this decades earlier. He said, "The mind you think with is not the mind that knows. That beneath the chatter is a deeper intelligence, but you can only access it by getting out of your own way." One of his most repeated instructions was this: stop trying to figure it out. He told people that the compulsion to analyze, to understand, to control every outcome through thought was the exact mechanism keeping them stuck. That life doesn't respond to your thinking, it responds to your state. And your state is determined not by what you think, but by whether you're thinking at all. A man in 1938 asked Cayce why his prayers weren't working. Cayce's response was blunt. He said the man wasn't praying. He was talking to himself in the language of prayer. That real prayer required silence. That the words were just more mental noise. That God, or the universe, or whatever deeper intelligence he was trying to reach, couldn't hear him through the static. The reading suggested that most people never actually pray. They rehearse, they repeat, they fill the space where connection could happen with the same thoughts they've always had. This idea appears in contemplative traditions across cultures, but Cayce framed it without mysticism. He framed it as practical psychology. He said that the mind, when full, can only operate within its existing parameters, that it will solve problems the same way, choose the same patterns, react the same way to every new stimulus. That creativity, insight, and transformation require space. And space is the one thing most people never allow. Brain scans of long-term meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network. Their brains spend less time in self-referential thought, and they report higher levels of clarity, creativity, and emotional regulation. Not because they trained their minds to think better, but because they trained their minds to stop. Cayce suggested this wasn't a spiritual achievement, it was a prerequisite for living clearly. But here's the third contradiction. Emptying your mind doesn't mean detachment. Cayce never told people to disengage from life. He told them to engage more fully. He said that when the mind is quiet, you actually see what's in front of you. You stop projecting. You stop interpreting everything through the lens of your accumulated fears and judgments. You become present. And presence, he insisted, is the only state from which real change is possible. A woman in 1941 asked him how to stop feeling anxious about the future. He didn't give her a technique. He gave her a diagnosis. He said her anxiety wasn't about the future. It was about her refusal to be where she was. That every time she mentally leaped forward, she abandoned the present. And the present was the only place where her life was actually happening. He told her that emptying her mind wasn't about escaping the future. It was about returning to the only moment she had any power in. Modern psychology calls this rumination and future-oriented worry. It's linked to depression and anxiety disorders. Cognitive science shows that people who spend more time in mental time travel, revisiting the past or rehearsing the future, report lower life satisfaction. Cayce described it differently. He said these people weren't living, they were haunting themselves. In over 14,000 readings, Cayce returned to one image repeatedly: the mind as a garden. He said most people never weed the garden. They just keep planting new goals, new beliefs, new plans, and the garden becomes overgrown. Nothing can grow properly because there's no space, no light, no room for anything to take root. He said that emptying the mind is the act of clearing the garden, not to abandon it, but to let something real grow. This contradicts the modern obsession with productivity and constant mental engagement. It contradicts the idea that more information, more thinking, more planning leads to better outcomes. Cayce suggested that the opposite is true, that the more you fill your mind, the less room you have for the insights that could actually change your life. That wisdom doesn't come from accumulation, it comes from subtraction. In a 1940 reading, a man asked how to make better decisions. Cayce told him to stop deciding, to empty his mind completely and let the decision reveal itself. The man pushed back. He said that sounded passive. Cayce clarified. He said that real decisions don't come from weighing options, they come from clarity. And clarity only emerges when the noise stops.
He said that most people make decisions from fear, from conditioning, from the momentum of old patterns, and those decisions just perpetuate the same life. He told the man that if he wanted a different outcome, he had to stop thinking from the same mind. Neuroscience research into insight shows that breakthroughs often happen during moments of mental rest. The brain's problem-solving activity increases when the conscious mind disengages. The solution appears not from more thinking, but from stepping back. Cayce pointed to this long before fMRI technology existed. He said that the mind, when emptied, becomes a receiver, that it tunes into something larger than its own accumulated content. But he also warned that most people misinterpret emptiness as passivity, that they equate a quiet mind with doing nothing. He said the opposite is true, that a quiet mind is the most active state a person can achieve, because it's the only state where they're not operating on autopilot, not running scripts, not repeating patterns. They're actually awake. And this is where Cayce's message becomes uncomfortable, because it implies that most of what people call thinking is not thinking at all. It's repetition, recycled judgments, old conclusions masquerading as new thoughts. He said that the average person has the same thoughts in slightly different forms every single day. And those thoughts create the same emotions, the same reactions, the same life. He didn't frame this as a moral failing. He framed it as a mechanical process, one that can only be interrupted by stopping the machine. A woman asked him in 1944 why she kept attracting the same kinds of relationships. He didn't analyze her patterns. He told her she was the pattern, that her mind had never emptied, that she brought the same fears, the same expectations, the same unspoken rules into every new connection, and that until she cleared those, she would only meet reflections of what she already believed. The reading was direct. He said that people don't attract what they want, they attract what they are, and what they are is determined by what they've never let go of. This contradicts the entire premise of manifestation culture. It contradicts the idea that you can think your way into a different reality. Cayce suggested that thinking is the problem, that the mind, when never emptied, becomes a filter, and that filter only lets through information that confirms what it already knows. That real change requires clearing the filter entirely, not to see better thoughts, but to see what's actually there. Psychological studies on confirmation bias support this. People unconsciously seek information that validates their existing beliefs. They ignore contradictory evidence. They reinterpret new experiences to fit old narratives. The mind, when full, becomes self-reinforcing. It builds a closed loop. And Cayce said that most people live their entire lives inside that loop, never questioning whether the loop itself is the cage. In his final years, Cayce's readings became more urgent. He told people that the world was entering a period of accelerated change, that old structures were collapsing, and that the only people who would navigate it clearly were those who could empty their minds. Not because emptiness is strength, but because a full mind can only repeat the past. And the past, he said, would no longer be a reliable guide. This wasn't prophecy, it was observation. He saw that people cling to mental models long after those models stop working, that they keep applying old solutions to new problems, and that the refusal to let go of accumulated thought is what creates suffering. He said that adaptation requires space, that you can't evolve while gripping everything you already know. And yet, most people resist this with everything they have. Because emptying the mind feels like losing yourself. It feels like death. Cayce acknowledged this. He said that the ego equates thought with existence, that the voice in your head insists it is you, and that silencing it feels like annihilation. But he said that the fear is misplaced, that what dies is not you. It's the repetition, the pattern, the accumulated noise that was never you in the first place. Modern research into neuroplasticity shows that the brain can rewire itself at any age. But rewiring requires new inputs. It requires breaking old patterns, and that only happens when the default pathways are interrupted. Cayce described this in non-scientific language. He said that the soul is trying to grow, but the mind, when cluttered, blocks it. That the only way to let the soul through is to get out of the way. He told people that this wasn't a one-time event, that emptying the mind is not a destination, it's a practice. That every day the mind fills itself again, with reactions, with judgments, with fears, and that every day the practice is the same, to notice, to stop, to clear. In his final recorded reading in 1944, someone asked him what the most important thing a person could do in their lifetime was. His answer was immediate. Stop filling your mind with noise. Let it be still, because everything you're searching for is already there. You just can't hear it through the static. But what he didn't say, and what the readings only implied, is that most people will never do this. That the compulsion to think, to analyze, to control is too strong. That emptiness feels too much like vulnerability, and so they keep the mind full, they keep the noise running, and they wonder why nothing changes. The question isn't whether Cayce was right. The question is whether you're willing to test it. To stop, even for a moment, and notice what's underneath all the thought. Not to find an answer, but to find out what happens when the questioning stops. Because maybe that's where your life has been waiting all along.